If you study military fieldcraft long enough, you start to notice something surprising. Modern special forces aren't inventing half their shelter techniques, they're rediscovering them. The best methods for staying alive in the field were hammered out by men who had no margin for error. WWII. Soldiers fought in deserts, jungles, frozen wastelands, and bombed-out cities. They didn't have Gore-Tex, carbon fiber frames, or climate-controlled gear. What they did have was ingenuity, and some of their shelter tricks were so effective that today's elite troops, from Arctic warfare units to jungle regiments, still use them almost unchanged. Let's walk through 6 WWII shelter methods that survived the test of time because they simply worked. 1. The snow cave and candle trick that modern Arctic units still teach. The snow cave isn't new, but WWII turned it into a survival science. Allied and Axis troops fighting in Norway, Finland, and the Eastern Front discovered that the most reliable winter shelter wasn't a tent at all. It was snow. Digging a deep dome-shaped cavity created an insulated chamber that could trap body heat, mute wind, and maintain a surprisingly stable internal temperature. But the real trick, the one most people forget, is the single candle. A single paraffin candle inside a properly constructed cave can raise the internal temperature by up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It melts microscopic layers inside the walls, which then refreeze into a hardened ice shell, strengthening the structure. German Gabeljäger, Soviet ski troops, and British commandos all documented this method. Today, U.S. Navy SEAL cold units, Canadian Rangers, and Norwegian FSK still teach nearly the exact same technique. So, the modern application is pretty straightforward. Dig high, create a sleeping shelf that's above the cold air sink, and use just enough candle heat to harden the walls without dripping water. It works because, well, physics hasn't changed. 2. The German igloo bunker that became the blueprint for modern snow fortifications. While the snow cave was a quick personal shelter, the Wehrmacht developed something bigger, the igloo bunker. Think of it as a hybrid between a snow cave and a fortified igloo. These structures were used by German mountain and Arctic units who needed sustainable multi-man hideouts that blended perfectly with the environment. The trick was layering blocks of hard-packed snow outside a hollow domed interior and a secondary inner wall that reduced condensation and acted as a thermal buffer. Vent holes were placed low and sleeping platforms high, forcing cold air downward and warm air upward. Modern Arctic militaries still use the underlying principles: multi-layer snow walls, raised platforms, cold air traps, and progressive ventilation holes. Special forces who operate in polar regions still rely on natural insulation far more than synthetic gear when temperatures plunge below what tents can handle. If you want to try the concept today, the principles remain the same. Use hard snow for structure, soft snow for ceiling gaps, and avoid perfectly vertical walls. Domes distribute stress better than squares. 3. Pacific jungle hammock systems that modern armies still copy. The United States Marines, British Chindits, and Australian commandos fighting in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands learned very quickly that sleeping on the ground was suicide. Leeches, fungus, foot rot, ants, snakes, and constant moisture made ground shelters miserable and dangerous. Enter the jungle hammock system. These weren't backyard hammocks. World War II jungle troops suspended themselves above the moisture line, enclosed the hammock with mosquito netting, and used an overhead tarp stretched tight to deflect tropical downpours. Airflow underneath prevented heat rash and fungal infections, a major threat that often removed more soldiers from combat than bullets. Modern special forces adopted nearly the same system: elevated sleep-breathable mosquito netting, minimal ground contact, and a tensioned waterproof fly. If you look at modern British SAS, US Special Forces, or Australian Commando Regiment jungle manuals, the DNA traces straight back to World War II hammock doctrine. In survival training, the takeaway is universal. Get off the ground. Elevation is protection. 4. Dugout shell scrapes that became the father of modern hasty fighting positions. A shell scrape seems primitive, just a shallow trench shaped to a soldier's body, but World War II infantry used them as rapid shelters from weather as much as from fire. They kept wind off the body, allowed a poncho or shelter have to be stretched over the top for a quick micro-shelter, and drastically improved heat retention. In wet environments, soldiers dug sumps, small pits that channeled water away from the sleeping area. This exact concept lives on in modern hasty shelters, Ranger foxholes, Marine Corps fighting positions, and NATO standard two-man dugouts. The layout, body-length trench, overhead tarp, drainage pit, hasn't changed because it doesn't need to. For practical use today, dig your living space slightly higher than the sump and angle the trench just enough to prevent pooling under your back. 5. Log and earth crawl tunnels borrowed from Soviet partisans. In the Eastern Front forests, partisans built tiny low-profile shelters using logs covered with earth, moss, and snow. They were completely camouflaged, retained warmth well, and were nearly impossible to spot from above. Access was through a narrow crawl tunnel that trapped heat like an airlock. Modern special forces use the same principle for covert observation posts. Low thermal signature, heavily insulated, naturally camouflaged, and separated entry tunnels to prevent heat loss. The concept works because the Earth itself becomes insulation and concealment. If you're applying the idea today, think small. Smaller volume means less heat loss. 6. Urban rubble shelters that became the model for modern hide sites. In ruined cities like Aachen, Stalingrad, Manila, and Monte Cassino, soldiers created improvised shelters inside rubble piles. They carved pockets behind collapsed walls, reinforced them with beams, and lined them with cloth to cut drafts. These hideouts protected them from weather, artillery fragments, and enemy eyes. Modern special forces use almost identical techniques when building urban hide sites. Small cavities, insulated walls, multiple exits, and complete visual concealment. The World War II innovation wasn't the shelter itself, it was the idea that the best cover is what already exists. World War II's shelter tricks weren't primitive gimmicks, they were refined, field-tested solutions that modern elite units still trust because they solve physics problems, not just military ones. And, honestly, the next time you see a Special Forces cold weather dome, a jungle, hammock rig, or a covert urban hide, you're seeing history still in action. If you want more real fieldcraft and hard history, not recycled myths, subscribe to the channel and share this video. This is the kind of knowledge that deserves to stay alive.